Subscribe before the truth disappears behind steel and concrete. The first sprint began where no one was supposed to run. A janitor's cart lay on its side in the corridor, mop water spreading in a thin, shining sheet under fluorescent lights. A radio crackled on the floor, half submerged, spitting out clipped words that never finished forming. Somewhere down the tier, a door slammed hard enough to shutter the metal frame. Then another. Then a chorus, steel on steel, like the jail itself was trying to shake something loose. Mateo Rivera didn't look like the kind of man who could outrun anything. 22, slight, shoulders drawn forward as if bracing for impact even when nothing touched him. In his intake photo, he'd worn a county-issued sweatshirt and a street face that tried to be blank. On this night, he moved like a cornered animal, fast, panicked, and silent. Bare sneakers skidding on waxed concrete as he cut past a set of barred gates that should have been locked. He had a green wristband from medical. That meant nothing at Rikers, except that he'd been seen by someone earlier and was supposed to be somewhere else now. He passed a wall-mounted camera with the dome cover scratched cloudy by years of cleaning chemicals and heat. In the footage later, it would look like a ghost camera watching a ghost boy, his outline smeared by motion, his head turning slightly as if he could feel eyes behind the plastic. Behind him came the sound that made every neck stiffen in every unit. Keys running. A correction officer rounded the corner with a flashlight, beam swinging wildly. The officer's uniform shirt was untucked, and his breathing came out sharp and angry as if he'd been interrupted mid-sentence. He shouted a number, housing area, floor, someone's name, but the words drowned in the building's constant roar. Televisions, arguments, men calling out to men they couldn't see. Mateo didn't shout back. He didn't even glance over his shoulder. He hugged the right-hand wall, took a turn into a service hallway, and disappeared into a section of the jail that smelled different. Less sweat, more dust and old paint, a place where the air didn't move. That was when a second alarm began to pulse, deep and steady, like a slow heartbeat amplified through concrete. Earlier that day, Rikers was the same as it always was, an enormous machine running hot, crowded, and uneven, with too many bodies and too little space to place them. Men slept in daylight and stayed awake all night, because the noise never stopped long enough for the mind to settle. Officers rotated through shifts that bled into each other. The island sat separated from the city by water, close enough to see the skyline, far enough to feel forgotten. The unit that held Mateo was not the kind shown in public tours. The paint had been layered repeatedly over years of damage, creating thick ridges along the bottom of walls. The floor had pale patches where something had been scrubbed too hard. Vents breathed out air that tasted metallic. The cells were narrow. The bunks creaked under weight. Between them, men learned quickly what mattered and what didn't. What mattered: your shoes, your commissary, your phone time, your name. What didn't: your paperwork, until it did. Mateo's case hadn't made news. Most didn't. A fight outside a bodega in the Bronx, an accusation that turned into an arrest, a bail amount his family couldn't touch. In the city's endless churn, he'd become one more intake number, one more wristband, one more file moving through a system that rarely noticed silence until it became a problem. He kept to himself, which at Rikers can be read as weakness or arrogance. Men tried him with jokes that weren't jokes. They borrowed things and didn't return them. They stepped into his space on purpose. Mateo responded by shrinking. He spoke only when he had to, and when he did, his voice carried a careful, controlled softness, as if loudness might summon attention he couldn't survive. The first time he went to medical, it wasn't for an injury anyone could see. He sat in a plastic chair under harsh light and answered questions in short phrases. He slept in thin bursts. He woke up gasping. He'd begun to count his breaths as a way to make time behave. The nurse gave him a green wristband and told him to drink water. The second time, he had bruising on the inside of his arm, a dark thumbprint shape high near the bicep, and a scratch at his throat that looked like a line drawn by a nail. He said he fell. In the unit, men pretended not to notice. At Rikers, noticing makes you part of something. The officer working that afternoon, Dana Klein, had been at the jail long enough to read the atmosphere like weather. She wasn't old, but the job had aged her in small ways. Tension at the corners of the eyes, and efficient impatience with excuses. She moved with a practiced straightness, shoulders back, keys clipped to her belt and always anchored by a thumb like a habit. She'd seen Mateo hover at the edge of everything, carrying his tray like it could shield him. She'd watched him keep his gaze down while other men looked up, scanning for weakness. When count cleared, the day should have settled. It rarely did. That evening, the lights dimmed but never went off. The unit transitioned into the long hours where the building's worst moods came out. Voices rose. A cup hit the floor. Someone laughed too hard at something that wasn't funny. Over the intercom, announcements blurred together. Movement, lockdown, movement again. Mateo was called out for medication. He walked out of the dorm line with his wristband visible, hands relaxed at his sides like he'd been taught, like he'd learned that stiff hands make officers think you're hiding something. He passed Dana's desk. She met his eyes for a second. He looked away quickly. Then he didn't come back. Not right away. Not in the normal slowness of jail time. Minutes became a stretch that felt wrong. Dana checked the log. Medical transport had cleared. The unit's roster still had Mateo in-house. A quick radio call went out. Another came back vague and irritated. He'd been seen. He was moving. He was where he was supposed to be. Except he wasn't. At Rikers, information can be as crowded as the dorms. Too many voices, too many versions, no clear lane for truth to move in a straight line. Dana stood and walked the corridor herself, passing cell fronts, shouting through the noise, scanning faces that stared back blankly or with open hostility. She checked the shower area, where steam clung heavy and men lingered longer than they should. She checked the phone bank, where arguments began and ended over plastic receivers. She checked a corner by the vending machine that didn't work, where contraband changed hands with casual confidence. Mateo wasn't there. The unit's background hum shifted into something tighter. Men began to watch Dana watch them. Small smiles appeared and disappeared. Someone whistled the tune that sounded like mockery. Someone else said Mateo's name loud enough for it to travel. Dana felt the change the way you feel a train coming through the tracks beneath your feet. It wasn't just one missing kid anymore. It was a disruption. And disruptions at Rikers have a way of becoming events. A supervisor arrived, stepping through the gate with the posture of someone who didn't want to be pulled into anything messy. He asked the question that changed the temperature in the room. Who had eyes on him last?
Dana's gaze drifted to the end of the corridor, to a maintenance door most people stopped seeing after a while. It wasn't part of daily movement. It wasn't used for normal operations. It simply existed. Gray paint, heavy hinges, a small sign that said, "Authorized personnel only," the letters fading from years of cleaning and indifference. The door was supposed to be sealed from the other side. Dana approached it slowly, like an instinct. Her keys hung heavy at her hip. The hallway around her felt suddenly too quiet, as if the unit had decided to listen. Up close, she saw what she hadn't seen from the desk. A fresh scuff on the paint near the latch. A thin line of dust disturbed along the bottom edge, like the door had been moved recently. And, taped low near the frame, almost hidden where no one would think to look, a strip of white medical tape with handwriting on it, block letters made with a felt-tip pen. Mateo, 7:18. Dana's throat tightened. The time wasn't a housing unit time. It wasn't an appointment time. It was a mark. A message. A way of recording something that wasn't supposed to be recorded. Behind her, the unit noise surged back in, out of sync with her sudden stillness. She raised her radio and spoke, keeping her voice flat to hide what was happening inside her chest. Officers moved in. A flashlight beam skated over the door's seam. The supervisor tried the handle. It opened. Not wide, not smoothly. It gave with a reluctant groan as if it hadn't been used in years and hated being disturbed. A dark gap appeared, breathing out air that smelled like damp concrete and old metal. Dana leaned forward, and her flashlight found the first steps of a narrow service stairwell heading down into a place the jail didn't show. On the wall inside, someone had drawn arrows in marker, quick, crooked, urgent. They pointed downward. At the bottom of the visible steps, just where the light began to die, something pale lay folded on the concrete like a discarded rag. Dana took one step closer, then another, and the beam revealed it clearly. A fresh scuff on the paint near the latch. A thin line of dust disturbed along the bottom edge, like the door had been moved recently. And, taped low near the frame, almost hidden where no one would think to look, a strip of white medical tape with handwriting on it, block letters made with a felt-tip pen. Mateo Rivera. And beneath it, pressed flat against the damp floor as if someone had tried to hide it in plain sight, a second strip of white tape with handwriting, so neat it looked calm. Not lost. Moved. Dana didn't speak. For a moment, neither did anyone else. Then, deep inside the service stairwell, in the dark below where the flashlight couldn't reach, a metal door slammed, hard, final, and close enough to be real.
The slam in the darkness didn't just close a door. It closed a possibility. For a brief moment, every sound in the housing area seemed to retreat behind the concrete. Televisions muffled, voices lowered, even footsteps held back, until the reality of what had happened caught up to everyone at once. A missing detainee wasn't a rumor anymore. It had a direction. Down. Dana Klein kept her flashlight steady on the stairwell while officers crowded the threshold behind her. The beam made the concrete steps look wet, even where they were dry, the walls stained with long-past leaks and the ash-colored fingerprints of maintenance work. The air was cooler in that opening, heavy with the smell of metal and old water, like the building's lungs had a separate, older breath beneath the living spaces. The supervisor's radio hissed with overlapping voices. Lockdown orders snapped through, then echoed again. Units sealing, gates clanging shut, movement cut off in a wave. In the dorm behind them, men reacted the way people always do when the jail tightens. Some shouted, some laughed too loudly, some went still and watched, eyes measuring what this might mean for them. Dana stood on the first step. She didn't rush down. In a place like this, speed is how you get cornered. She moved with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that the stairwell wasn't a hallway, it was a funnel. One person in, one person out, and anyone below would hear you coming long before your light reached them. The torn green wristband lay on the concrete like a small, ugly proof. The words on the medical tape, "not lost," moved, had the cold certainty of someone who believed they could write a verdict and make it true. Dana looked back over her shoulder toward the dorm. The men were blocked behind gates now, pressed up to metal like spectators at an arena. Faces hovered in the narrow spaces between bars. Some wore open curiosity. Others wore something close to satisfaction, as if they'd been waiting for the building to show its worst self. Rikers had been under scrutiny for years, and the reasons were always the same: overcrowding, violence, exhausted staff, frayed systems that broke under pressure. Everyone on the island knew those words. They were headlines to the outside world, routine to the people trapped inside. But none of it prepared anyone for the simple, immediate dread of a single person disappearing into the building's bones. A tactical team was called. Not the kind the public imagines. No cinematic entrance, no dramatic speeches, just officers in heavier vests, moving with measured urgency, carrying shields scuffed from previous incidents, faces tight with the effort of staying controlled. They brought more flashlights, more radios, and a kind of practiced quiet. They also brought a master key ring that looked like it had its own weight of consequences. The first descent took them into a service level that didn't belong to any one housing unit. It belonged to everything: pipes, wires, locked grates, low ceilings. The light came in slices. The whole place was narrow enough to make shoulders brush walls. Somewhere nearby, a pump clicked and sputtered, pushing water away from a drain. The sound was steady, mechanical, indifferent to what people did down here. And there were signs, not official ones, not maintenance markers, human signs. A chalk line on the wall that ended in an arrow. A strip of torn cloth tied to a conduit like a trail marker. On a corner, the number 718 written in black marker. Too neat to be casual, too placed to be accident. In a building with thousands of men cycling through, this wasn't random graffiti. This was navigation. Dana felt the shape of it in her stomach. Someone used these spaces. Someone moved through them on purpose. They cleared the first corridor and found a door that should have been sealed shut with years of rust. It wasn't rusted. The latch was clean where hands had touched it often. The hinges squeaked, but not like old hinges, like hinges that were forced to pretend they were old. Beyond it, a narrow room with stacked plastic bins, broken fans, and folded tables stamped with the city's property markings. Nothing unusual, until the light hit the floor. There were footprints. Not just one set, many, overlapping, tracked through faint dust the way someone tracks through fresh snow. They led to the far wall where a panel sat slightly misaligned, off by a fraction, just enough that a person who handled it often would notice the difference. One officer reached for it. Dana watched his hand pause, and she understood why. Touching the panel would change everything. In a place built on deniability, every hidden door was a question that someone had worked hard to keep unasked. The panel came free with a soft scrape, and the cavity behind it revealed a narrow pass-through, barely wide enough for a person to turn sideways. The edges were smoothed from contact. This wasn't a one-time escape route. This was a corridor that had been used so many times that it had softened. The tactical team moved first, shoulders angled, lights pushed ahead. Dana followed, her keys quiet now, her breathing controlled. Inside the pass-through, the air thinned and warmed. The smell changed. Less damp concrete, more stale sweat, the scent of bodies in an enclosed space. Somewhere deeper in the building, a fan hummed. Somewhere else, water ran in a pipe and then stopped abruptly, as if someone had shut a valve. They emerged into another service hallway that connected to a locked gate, one of the internal gates meant to separate zones. The gate's padlock wasn't broken. It was unlocked. A key had been used that meant access. That meant somebody who was supposed to control movement had already decided to give it away. Above them, through the ceiling, came the faint vibration of the dorm's noise, the living world pressing down like weight. Down here, in the unlit corridors, the jail felt less like an institution and more like a labyrinth. The radios began to fill with new information, partial and frustrating. A camera feed in the housing area had glitched. Another had gone dark. A third was looping the same 15 seconds over and over again, showing an empty corridor that didn't match what officers were seeing in real time. It was the kind of malfunction everyone at Rikers recognized. A convenient failure. Dana pictured the dome camera Mateo had passed earlier, its scratched cover, its indifferent stare. She imagined the control room with its wall of monitors, familiar faces and swivel chairs. She imagined someone's hand on a switch, someone turning away as if nothing had happened. Up in the dorms, lockdown tightened. Meals were delayed. People banged on doors. For many detainees, the routine discomfort of incarceration became sharper, more personal, because when one person disappears, everyone fears the next absence could be theirs. Men who had done nothing related to Mateo now felt their own vulnerability, their own invisibility. Mateo's sister, Marisol, was on the outside, refreshing her phone again and again with no new calls. She lived in a cramped apartment where the radiator clicked too loudly, where the air smelled like cooking oil from the apartment below. She had been saving for bail in slow, humiliating increments. She had been sending money to commissary because she had heard, like everyone hears, that a person without commissary becomes a person without protection. That night, her messages were unread. In the jail, Mateo stopped being a person and became a gap, a blank space in roster counts, a question in clipped radio phrases, a weight in the stomach of the officer who'd last seen him alive in the light. Down in the service levels, the team found the first true sign of recent struggle. Not blood, not gore, just the aftermath that violence leaves when it's controlled enough to avoid mess. A bent pair of glasses crushed under a metal cabinet, a torn piece of paper stuck to a wall, damp from someone's hand. On it, in faded ink, were the first letters of a name, Mate, before the rest ripped away. Near a utility sink, a clean orange jumpsuit top lay folded too neatly for abandonment. The size tag was intact. The fabric smelled faintly of bleach, as if someone had tried to erase the fact that a body had been inside it. Dana stared at that folded uniform and understood something she didn't want to understand. This wasn't a spontaneous run. This was a transfer. Someone had removed Mateo from the official flow, out of the dorm, out of medical, out of the places where movements are tracked, and they had done it with enough confidence to leave a message behind. Not lost, moved.
They moved again, deeper. The corridors narrowed. A series of doors appeared, each labeled with old stenciled numbers that didn't match any current map. The master keyring turned in locks with reluctant clunks. The air grew stiller. The farther they went, the more the jail's living noise faded until the only sounds were their boots, their radios, and the faint hum of electricity. Then they reached a door that wasn't on the old labels at all. No stencil number, no warning sign, just a flat gray slab of metal with a new lock bolted onto old steel, as if someone had upgraded it in a hurry and hoped no one would ask why. The tactical leader tested it. The master keys didn't fit. Dana felt cold spread across her skin, not from the air but from the implication. A lock that wasn't part of the jail's key system meant a private boundary inside a public institution. They stepped back. Someone brought a tool. The scraping sounds echoed through the service corridor, like it was amplifying the act itself. In the dorms above, detainees listened to the distant vibration of something happening and turned their heads toward the sound without knowing why. The bolt gave way with a sudden snap. The door swung inward. The flashlight beam swept across the room beyond, and for a second, everyone froze, because the space wasn't storage, and it wasn't mechanical. It was furnished. A cheap folding chair, a small desk, a plastic fan, a row of hooks on the wall holding extra uniforms, some officer gray, some detainee orange, a portable phone charger plugged into the wall with the cable running to a burner phone lying face down on the desk. And on the concrete floor, knees pulled to chest, wrists bound with torn sheet fabric, sat Mateo Rivera, alive, pale, and staring at the light like it hurt. Dana took one step forward, and Mateo flinched, then spoke before anyone could stop him. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in that small room it landed like a weight. "They're not hiding me," he said. "They're waiting." He lifted his chin toward the corner of the room where a second door stood behind a hanging tarp, one that hadn't been noticed at first because the tarp blended into the shadows. From behind it a phone began to ring, soft at first, then louder, vibrating against the desk until it sounded like a warning. And Mateo, still bound, still shaking, looked directly at Dana and said the sentence that turned the whole search into something else. "They want you to open the next door."
The ringing didn't belong underground. It was the wrong sound for a service corridor. Too modern, too precise, too confident. It shook against cheap plastic on the desk and filled the small furnished room with a vibration that felt intentional, like someone wanted every person standing there to hear it. Mateo Rivera sat on the floor with his wrists bound in torn sheet fabric, shoulders tight from holding himself small for too long. The flashlight beams made his skin look paper-thin, the kind of pale that comes from sleeplessness and fear. His eyes flicked toward the tarp-covered corner again, then back to Dana Klein, as if he was trying to warn her without moving his mouth much. Up above, the jail kept living. Lockdown had silenced movement, not noise. Men yelled through doors. Someone pounded a bunk frame until the sound became a dull, steady metronome. In other housing areas, officers paced with keys and radios, waiting for instructions that never came in clean sentences. The island didn't stop when something went wrong. It simply tightened around it. Down here, in the hidden room that shouldn't have existed, the phone rang long enough to feel like an ultimatum. Dana didn't answer it. Nobody did. Eventually, it went to a stop, cut off abruptly, not because the caller gave up, but because they decided that the ringing had done its job. Silence took its place, thicker than before. The tarp in the corner hung from a line like a curtain at the back of a cheap stage. Behind it, the second door stood as Mateo had described, taller than it needed to be, its surface newer than the surrounding concrete, its frame clean where old paint should have been chipped. On the floor, at its base, was another strip of medical tape, pressed down carefully with fingertips. Open it. The words didn't look rushed. They looked practiced. Dana could feel the room's attention settle on her, not because anyone needed her permission, but because she was the one who had taken the first step down. In institutions, the person who moves first often becomes the person blamed first. She crouched beside Mateo. The knot on his wrists had been tied with a kind of haste that makes fabric bite into skin. She didn't fumble. Her hands were steady, keys and cuffs familiar objects in a world built around them. She loosened the sheet strips and freed him, and Mateo's hands dropped into his lap with a numb heaviness, fingers flexing like they'd forgotten their own purpose. He didn't stand right away. He stared at the second door the way some people stare at open water, like it could swallow them without effort. "They use this," he said softly, voice scraped thin. "They move people, and if you say anything, you don't come back upstairs the same." No one asked him who they were. The answer wouldn't be a name anyway. At Rikers, they was a shape, shifting between uniforms and detainees, and the blurred space were power-traded hands. The tactical team leader stepped toward the door. The master keyring didn't fit. Again. The lock wasn't part of city infrastructure. It was private inside public. A tool came out. Metal met metal. The sound echoed down the service arteries and returned as if the building wanted to repeat it, to make sure everyone understood what was being done. When the lock finally broke, the door opened inward without resistance, like it had been waiting to be opened all along. The air that spilled out was warm and stale, carrying the flat smell of unwashed fabric, old food wrappers, and something else, something chemical, like cleaning agents used too often in the same small space. Behind the door was not a single room. It was a corridor, a long, narrow passage that ran straight into darkness, lined with temporary lighting that someone had installed and then tried to make look permanent. Extension cords were strapped to conduits. Fluorescent strips buzzed faintly. Along the floor, a thin line of tape marked a walking path, as if someone had tried to impose order on what was fundamentally illicit. Dana stepped through. The corridor walls were cinderblock painted the same institutional gray as the rest of Rikers, but the scuffs and scratches here told a different story. Drag marks, shoe lines, handprints in places people don't touch unless they're being pushed. Halfway down the corridor, the opening into a larger space, an abandoned unit that didn't appear abandoned. Rows of cells stood open, not open for supervision, open for use. Thin mattresses lay in some, stained with sweat patterns from bodies that had been there too long. In a corner, a stack of orange uniforms sat bundled in a plastic bin, sizes mixed, as if clothing had been taken and reissued without records. Near a wall was a folding table with cheap plastic trays and a water jug. There were chargers plugged into a power strip. There were cigarettes crushed into a coffee can. There was quiet evidence of a place that operated on its own schedule. Mateo's breathing turned shallow. He stopped at the threshold, eyes moving fast across details, as if his mind was trying to count exits, count threats, count seconds. "They use this," he murmured. "They put you here when you're a problem." Not solitary confinement as it was officially described. Cells logged, checks recorded, policies written. This felt like something older and more brutal, a shadow version of the same punishment, made easier by the jail's chaos and the city's exhaustion. A door at the far end of the unit stood closed. Its surface had dents at shoulder height and scratches along the edge, as if it had been hit more than once. Beside it, a clipboard hung from a nail. Dana walked closer, flashlight beam steady. The paper on the clipboard was lined, covered with handwriting, names, and numbers, and times. Some were detainee numbers. Some were housing unit codes. Some were initials that could have belonged to anyone. But at the top of the page, in heavier ink, was a phrase written like a header. Transfer list, off books. Dana felt the inside of her mouth go dry. She didn't need to analyze it to understand what it meant. It meant this unit wasn't an accident. It meant it had a process. It meant it had been happening long enough to develop routine. And in the middle of the list, written cleanly in block letters, was Mateo Rivera. Time, 7:18. The same time on the tape upstairs. Dana turned her head slowly, letting the light sweep. In the nearest open cell, a man lay on a mattress staring up at the ceiling, eyes wide and unfocused, the expression of someone whose mind had chosen distance as survival. In another cell, someone sat with knees drawn up, face turned toward the wall, as if looking at the room was too dangerous. A third cell held nothing but a blanket folded with military neatness, and a plastic cup half full of water, untouched. This wasn't a movie set. It was worse, because it was ordinary, because the objects were cheap and real, because the misery had been arranged with the same efficiency as anything else inside the jail. A radio voice crackled from behind, distant now, distorted by concrete and distance. Something about movement, something about a gate that shouldn't be open. Someone asking again and again where the team was. Then the lights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a stutter. Enough for the room to shift from clear to uncertain. Enough for fear to step forward. From somewhere deeper in the unit, a metal door clanged. Then a sound like a heavy object hitting the wall. One reverberating thud that traveled through the corridor and into bones. The tactical team tightened instinctively, shields angled, bodies turning to cover angles that suddenly mattered more than anything. Dana felt her heart rate rise, not into panic, but into that sharp alertness that makes time stretch thin. Mateo stepped back without being told. He moved as if he'd rehearsed retreat, as if he'd learned the exact distance to keep from danger while still pretending to cooperate. The door at the far end of the unit swung open without resistance, like it had been waiting to be opened all along.
A figure appeared, an officer in uniform gray, but without the tight, correct look of someone on regular duty. His shirt was wrinkled, his vest looked older. His face was half-lit by the failing fluorescent, expression unreadable, not because he was calm, but because he had practiced being unreadable. He didn't shout, he didn't charge.
He simply stood there and looked at them like they were trespassing in his space. Behind him, faintly, more movement, shadows shifting, a second person, maybe a third. The officer's gaze landed on Dana and held. In that still contact, the message from the medical tape took on its full meaning. They hadn't hidden Mateo to escape. They had moved him to bait a door open, so the wrong people would walk into the wrong corridor at the wrong time with the wrong intention. The officer's hand lifted slightly, and in it was a phone, another burner, screen lit, recording. This wasn't just control, it was leverage. Dana felt the trap close, not with bars, but with narrative. In a place already under scrutiny and suspicion, all it took was the right footage at the right moment to ruin a career, to bury accountability, to redirect blame. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The buzzing fluorescent strips dimmed to a sickly glow. For a second, everyone's faces looked hollowed out. Mateo's voice cut through the room, small but urgent. "They're going to say you did it. They're going to say you took me." Dana didn't answer. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. She did the one thing the trap hadn't accounted for. She turned her flashlight beam away from the officer and swept it across the unit, wide and slow, illuminating the open cells, the mattresses, the folded uniforms, the clipboard, and the people lying silent inside. The light didn't argue, it simply showed. For a second, the officer's expression shifted, just a flicker of irritation, like a man watching his clean lie get smudged. Then, from above, the building responded in its own chaotic language. A lockdown gate somewhere upstairs slammed shut with such force it made dust fall from the ceiling here. Radios erupted with overlapping calls. A siren began to wail, not the steady pulse from earlier, but a sharper, escalating tone that meant the jail was closing itself like a fist. The officer at the far door glanced up, as if he could feel the institution tightening around him too. His confidence wavered in the smallest way, that brief moment when a person realizes the machine they rely on might not protect them this time. The unit didn't explode into cinematic violence. It didn't need to. The danger was in the choices that followed. The tactical team moved with disciplined speed, overcoming the narrow geometry of hallways and doors, bodies coordinating in silence. The officer at the far end stepped back, disappearing into the darkness beyond his doorway, not charging, not surrendering, simply retreating into the parts of the jail that were built to swallow people and actions whole. Dana grabbed Mateo by the shoulder, not rough, just firm, and guided him back into the corridor, back toward the door they'd entered through. He stumbled once, then caught himself, eyes fixed on the floor, like he didn't trust his own balance. As they moved, Dana saw something she'd missed on the way in. A small, deliberate marking on the corridor wall, drawn in black marker right at eye level. A set of letters. D.K. Her initials. Not carved, not scratched, written cleanly, as if someone wanted her to see them and understand you were expected. When they burst back into the furnished room, the burner phone on the desk lit up again, not ringing now, but vibrating with a new notification that flashed on the screen before the light went dark. One more time. Dana didn't stop to read further. She didn't touch it. She kept moving. They climbed the stairwell fast, the air growing colder with each step, the building's living noise coming back in layers, the shouting, the banging, the televisions, the relentless sound of too many human beings packed into too little space. When they emerged into the housing corridor, officers rushed in around them, voices urgent, faces tense. Mateo was handed off, escorted away with a protective intensity that looked almost like care, though it was built from fear of liability as much as concern. Dana Klein stood for a beat at the threshold of the maintenance door and stared back down into the shadow where the service stairs disappeared. She knew, with an exhausted clarity, that the island didn't need supernatural secrets, it only needed hidden doors and people willing to use them. Over the next 48 hours, the jail shifted into a different kind of panic, the public kind. Movement protocols changed, units were searched, supervisors spoke in tightly controlled sentences. Men were relocated. Some doors that had always been closed were suddenly rediscovered and sealed. Some cameras that had always had blind spots were suddenly fixed. To the outside world, it looked like response. Inside, it felt like containment. Mateo Rivera did not go home. He was still in the system, still wearing state-issued clothing, still sleeping under fluorescent light. But he was moved, this time officially, into a different housing area, away from the unit he'd vanished from. His sister Marisol finally received a call that lasted less than 2 minutes. His voice was flat, careful, and oddly distant, as if he was reading from a script he didn't trust. "I'm okay," he said. Then quieter, "Don't call every day." Dana Klein returned to work, because that's what people do at Rikers. They come back because rent is due, because the job has sunk into their life, because leaving doesn't erase what they've seen. On her third shift after the incident, she walked past the same maintenance door. The paint looked the same again, scuffs wiped clean, dust line restored. The authorized personnel only sign had been replaced. Fresh, white, crisp letters, a neat attempt at normal. But at the bottom of the frame, placed where only someone close would notice, a new white medical tape had been pressed down. No name this time, just 2 words in block letters. Moved again. Dana stared at it for a long moment, then kept walking because stopping was an invitation. And somewhere in the building's lower levels, behind doors that weren't on any map, the jail's hidden corridors remained exactly what they had always been: quiet, used, and waiting. If you thought this one was wild, wait for the next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what darkness looks like in daylight.